Good morning and welcome to the Center for Strategic and International Studies. My name is Jacob Kurtzer. I'm very grateful and pleased to see so many friendly and new faces here today. For those watching online, welcome to CSIS Online. For those in person, you'll know that, at least for the Humanitarian Agenda, we're a safety-first oriented program. So the first thing I'm going to do is point out our emergency exit signs back here and the way you came in. In case of any emergency, I would ask that you follow my instructions or the instructions of my colleague, Jude Larnard, for evacuation of the building. This morning's session is the opening of a two-day conference CSIS, the Humanitarian Agenda, is co-hosting in partnership with the Norwegian Refugee Council and supported generously by the Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance at USAID. Humanitarian access remains the predominant challenge for the humanitarian community and the various different challenges that organizations and individuals affected by armed conflict face to receive the basic needs that they need to sustain themselves. 4 years ago, CSIS, again, with the support of then OFDA, launched a task force on humanitarian access to look at the challenges in the contemporary humanitarian universe. We published a report, held a lot of consultations, and access and trying to overcome the access challenges, be they logistical, be they security, be they assertive states, or be they from the policies and regulations imposed by donors, remains a central theme for the humanitarian agenda to this day. And yet any casual observer of the humanitarian spectrum would understand that in many ways the access environment has gotten worse, not better. And even the news of the recent days suggests that it's going to get worse further with the onset of fighting in Sudan and other challenges. So to kick us off today, we're extremely grateful to have a really meaningful and high-level panel. I'll spare introducing our speakers, but I'd like to just introduce our moderator, Rodi Margison. As long as I've worked in the humanitarian sector in Washington, Rodi has been a source of great knowledge for me and for the humanitarian advocacy and policy community. Rodi teaches in the Global Fellows Program at the University of Maryland, and in her day job is a specialist in humanitarian policy for the Congressional Research Service. So, Rodi, if I can invite you up to share some remarks and lead our conversation.
Jake, thank you for that kind introduction. Good morning, everyone. I want to express a warm welcome to our keynote speakers, Sarah, Charles, and Jan Egeland, and to all of you participating in person and online. This conference on sustaining access, humanitarian principles, practice, and policy for today's challenges provides an important opportunity to discuss humanitarian access amid unprecedented global humanitarian challenges. In a moment, I will introduce our speakers. First, though, I would like to set the stage with a few words about the scope of today's global humanitarian landscape. The views expressed here are mine and do not represent those of the Congressional Research Service or the Library of Congress. In 2003, the United Nations estimates that globally, nearly 340 million people, which includes over 103 million who are displaced, require urgent humanitarian and protection assistance. This is the highest on record, and experts say the numbers are likely to increase, with demand continuing to outpace funding, the distribution of which is often uneven across crises. A combination of new and protracted conflicts, persistent violence, climate-induced and other natural disasters, ongoing secondary impacts of COVID-19, economic shocks, and increasing malnutrition and food insecurity worldwide are primary drivers of this unprecedented level of humanitarian need. 4 years ago, when CSIS first published its Humanitarian Access Report, the UN 2019 Global Humanitarian Appeal sought $21.9 billion. The UN 2023 Global Humanitarian Appeal is for $51.5 billion. This is $30 billion higher and 2.5 times greater than in 2019. During this time, the number of people in need has also nearly tripled. The 2023 appeal reaches another new record amount for humanitarian funding appeals. Amid increasing global needs, humanitarian access remains a critical issue. It is considered a key to humanitarian action and the provision of life-saving assistance to vulnerable communities. Access restrictions such as conflict and insecurity, bureaucratic impediments, and physical constraints often hinder the work of relief agencies and their ability to respond to humanitarian and recovery needs, which some also assert make the humanitarian situation not only worse, but more costly. Events in Sudan over the last week and a half provide a glaring example. During this conference, we will have the opportunity to discuss current challenges affecting the ability of aid providers to operate in constrained environments and explore ways to refine humanitarian practice and policy to enable effective and principled response in hard-to-reach communities. The full program will explore the evolving access landscape in complex humanitarian responses. The breakout sessions will identify emerging trends in humanitarian access, including the impact of counterterrorism activities on principled humanitarian action, negotiating with non-traditional authorities, and working with local actors on the front lines. The theme of this morning's opening session is preserving and protecting principled humanitarian access. Sarah Charles will speak on efforts the U.S. Agency for International Development is taking to ensure principled humanitarian access around the world. Jan Egeland will offer remarks on the Norwegian Refugee Council's efforts to achieve critical access across their operations. Following their remarks, we will have a conversation. It is now my honor to introduce our speakers. Sarah Charles is the Assistant to the Administrator of USAID's Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance, or BHA, the US government lead for international disaster response. With a mandate to save lives, alleviate human suffering, and reduce the impact of disasters, BHA monitors, mitigates, and responds to global hazards and humanitarian needs. The Bureau also promotes resilience by preparing communities for disasters before they strike and by helping people recover and move beyond crises. Prior to her role at BHA, Sarah was the Senior Director for Policy and Advocacy for the International Rescue Committee. And before that, she staffed the National Security Council at the White House, first as the Director for Humanitarian Affairs, and then as the Director and Acting Senior Director for Strategic Planning. In these roles, Sarah played a central role in coordinating the international Ebola response and later coordinated the White House response to the global refugee and migration crisis, including the 2016 Leaders Summit on Refugees. Jan Egeland has been the Secretary General of NRC since August 2013, a role that oversees the work of the humanitarian organization in over 30 countries affected by conflict and disaster. In June 2021, he was appointed to promote and advocate for the advancement of commitments known as the Grand Bargain, an agreement between donors and humanitarian organizations to improve humanitarian action and better serve people in need. In 2021, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres appointed Jan as chair of the Independent Senior Advisory Panel on Humanitarian Deconfliction in Syria. In 2015, former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon appointed Jan as special advisor to the UN Special Envoy for Syria, where he chaired the humanitarian task force responsible for the safety and protection of Syrian civilians, a role he stepped down from in 2018. From 2011 to 2013, Jan served as the European Director of Human Rights Watch. And prior to that, he was appointed Special Advisor to the UN Secretary General for Conflict Prevention and Resolution. Jan was the UN Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator from 2003 to 2006. In that role, he helped reform the global humanitarian response system and organize the international response to many humanitarian crises. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to our speakers. And with that, I will now turn things over to Sarah Charles. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Jake, and thank you, Jake. And thank you, Rhodey, for that warm introduction. And in particular, thank you, CSIS and NRC, for the invitation to speak today. We're incredibly proud of the work that our partners, that many of those on your team do in the face of incredible obstacles every day. Standing here right now, it's impossible not to have front of mind our many Sudanese colleagues that are in Sudan as we speak, who have sustained repeated attacks as Sudan descends into almost unthinkable violence. We are committed to delivering principled, need-based humanitarian assistance in the face of skyrocketing needs. However, as many in this room know well, humanitarian access constraints remain one of the largest hurdles to delivering this support to those most in need. Every day, bureaucratic impediments, attacks on aid workers, outright blockades, and the politicization of humanitarian aid make it harder for responders to both identify and reach people in need of life-saving assistance. There is almost always a direct correlation between access and need. Nowhere is this more evident than in Burkina Faso. For more than a year, non-state groups have imposed a full blockade on Djibo in Sayoum province, home to more than 360 people. Our famine early warning system, or FuseNet, now projects a credible risk of famine in Djibo, a threat that did not exist before the blockade started. There are also widespread reports of severe wasting in children as well as adults already dying of hunger. This tragedy, far off the front page, was and is preventable. At AID, we are committed to helping our partners navigate these increasingly complex and dangerous environments and supporting aid workers around the world who face incredible risk in preserving life and human dignity. We are constantly asking ourselves at every level, how can we do more to support our partners? What can we do to lead and influence policies and actions that will facilitate greater access? Last month, Administrator Power released USAID's new policy framework, Driving Progress Beyond Programs. In it, USAID formally articulates our goals to confront the greatest challenges of our times, embrace new partnerships, and invest in enduring effectiveness. It serves as a frame for all of our efforts. We're proud of the achievements of the programs we fund around the world, not least of which the very important work we're supporting NRC to develop and strengthen the negotiating skills of humanitarian professionals, including through this conference today. But we also recognize to ensure USAID-funded programs have the greatest impact and ultimately create real change in the lives of many millions of people living in vulnerable situations, we need to leverage our voice as the US government. We are all keenly aware that humanitarian space is shrinking. This group knows all too well physical and institutional threats to aid work and aid workers. Every year, attacks on our colleagues, particularly our local staff, grow. Even as we meet today, we see this tragically playing out in Sudan with the escalation of fighting between the Rapid Support Forces and the Sudanese Armed Forces. The fighting has forced many humanitarian agencies to make the difficult decision to temporarily halt life-saving operations and evacuate staff from Sudan. Armed actors are targeting humanitarian assets and facilities, looting field vehicles, and damaging aircraft used to transport aid workers and assistance where they're needed most. At least 5 humanitarian personnel have already been killed in this conflict. Hundreds of humanitarian programs have been temporarily paused as a result of partners' inability to safely operate, impacting millions of vulnerable people in Sudan, including those recently displaced by this fighting. Today, local and national staff, often responding in their own communities, account for nearly all deaths, injuries, and kidnappings of humanitarian aid workers. We need real, tangible, and urgent solutions to protect them. Through our multi-year access project with NRC, we're building the capacity of the humanitarian community, from frontline workers to senior officials, to enable humanitarian access and programming in hard-to-reach areas. This work builds upon millions of dollars spanning more than a decade into humanitarian safety and security research and coordination, and the OCHA-funded To Stay and Deliver study, which prompted a seismic paradigm shift in humanitarian aid work more than a decade ago. Rather than determining the triggers that would lead an organization to leave an area due to conflict and insecurity, the goal for the last decade has been to prioritize efforts that enable organizations to stay on the ground and facilitate access to those in need. Unfortunately, much of the Stay and Deliver framework has resulted in the unintended consequence of transferring risk to local implementing partners and local aid workers. Now more than ever, we must double down on efforts to protect these local partners and local staff and reverse this trend. While research and training play an important role in improving access to populations in need and mitigating risks, we know that the rate of violence against aid workers largely relates to proximity to conflict, shrinking humanitarian space, and the politicization, if not weaponization, of humanitarian assistance. Diplomacy, advocacy, and new ways of working must go hand in hand with capacity building to protect aid workers and safeguard humanitarian operational independence and impartiality. Even when organizations are able to stay and deliver, physical barriers are cutting off access to millions of people in need. We saw this acutely in Ethiopia, where access to Tigray was restricted for nearly 2 years. Restrictions on physical access were compounded by blackouts on the internet, telecommunications, and banking services. Before the signing of the cessation of hostilities agreement in November, USAID largely measured access by the trickling of trucks that entered the region and metric tons of assistance carried by those trucks. But trucks are not access, and food, while important, is not sufficient for human well-being. In systematically blocking access, even when they allowed limited trucks in, the government of Ethiopia hamstrung the humanitarian response. As a community, we were denied the kind of sustained presence that would enable deep engagement of affected communities and the delivery of services, particularly for protection services, services for survivors of sexual violence, that we know should be part of every humanitarian response. In the less often talked about protection crisis in the Central Sahel, civilians continue to be targets of violence, face increasing displacement, and are deprived of basic services and livelihood opportunities needed to access food. In addition, women and girls face high risks of gender-based violence, including sexual exploitation and abuse. As armed groups continue to expand their area of influence, access constraints become even higher. Reaching back to the example of Burkina Faso, where armed groups have blockaded several cities, the World Food Programme estimates that 850,000 people, about 1/3 of the population in need, are residing in blockaded or hard-to-reach areas that lack basic services. We currently support WFP to use helicopters to airlift assistance to blockaded areas, which is expensive, unsustainable, and lacks the protection-focused interventions that we know are needed in periods of acute conflict. As you all well know, our jobs are even harder when humanitarian access is politicized. In Syria, we've provided assistance to more than 4 million people in the Northwest, including through the cross-border operation for over a decade. At the time of the February 6 earthquake, however, UN cross-border access was limited to only a single crossing, Baba al-Halwa. While the UN was able to negotiate the opening of 2 additional crossings in the weeks following the earthquake for a period of 3 months, it's unclear if they will remain open. The US government has long supported our NGO partners to use all available crossings into Syria. It's gutting that the Syrian regime and the Russian Federation see life-saving assistance as a bargaining chip every year, every 6 months, and now every 3 months. We will, of course, continue to advocate for the use of all 3 border crossings, as the continuation of cross-border assistance is critical to meet the acute needs of Syrians wherever they're in need. In Afghanistan, the Taliban's multiple edicts barring women from working for NGOs, and now the UN, are of course gross human rights violations, part of a systematic effort to restrict women's participation in public life. But they're also deeply obstructive. While we appreciate that partners have been able to negotiate carve-outs, these efforts by the Taliban prevent humanitarian assistance from reaching female beneficiaries at scale and expose them to further life-saving risks. We are determined to prevent the normalization of this obstruction. We recognize the increasingly difficult operating environment that the Taliban has created, which has already resulted in reduced operations for many of our partners. Engaging and supporting women is critical, and nothing less is acceptable. Women are a critical component of a society and cannot be erased by these edicts. In line with our commitment to progress beyond programs, we're funding urgently needed humanitarian assistance activities to those in greatest need, while also working to ensure that advocacy is at the heart of our action. This includes promoting the safety and security of aid workers, particularly in hard-to-reach or insecure environments. In Haiti, despite tremendous challenges, BHA partners and other humanitarian actors are proving every day, in this context that is often overlooked, that access is possible, even if variable and complicated. In Cité Soleil, for example, engagement by UN agencies with gangs last year enabled access to communities most severely affected by the crisis in Port-au-Prince. The latest food security analysis shows that the resulting increase in assistance was instrumental in preventing famine-like conditions. However, a recent surge in violence has again increased access challenges in Cité Soleil, underscoring just how precarious the situation is and how important sustained and elevated engagement is. We continue to urge partners to work collectively to reach those in need, including by engaging parties where necessary to gain access. Having a coordinated and principled approach to engagement, with gangs in particular, is crucial in this context, and we're committed to supporting our partners and platforms like the Access Working Group to ensure that aid safely reaches those most affected by the crisis. We also support organizations around the globe, such as Humanitarian Outcomes, Insecurity Insight, the Global Interagency Security Forum, and the International NGO Safety Organization, or INSO, which provides security coordination and analysis to help NGOs operate safely in complex environments like Haiti. The crisis in Afghanistan and many of the examples highlighted today also underscore the importance and relevance of some of our global programs, such as USAID and the State Department's joint Safe from the Start revision policy and program. Safe from the Start seeks to advance gender transformative approaches in humanitarian response and promotes women's leadership. In particular, prioritizing support and advocacy for gender-based violence prevention and shifts in funding, influence, and decision-making power to women and girls in all their diversity within humanitarian response systems. Safe from the Start revision calls on the humanitarian community and supports the humanitarian community to not only add to, but change conventional humanitarian response by, among other things, shifting power to crisis-affected women and girls and recognizing them as experts, providers, and leaders, which can only serve to strengthen responses such as the one in Afghanistan. Alongside our programs, we're engaged in the day-in, day-out diplomacy that's needed to secure humanitarian access and resolution of conflict. There are few donors that are as present in as many places as we are. Part of that presence is working with partners, but also our embassies and other parts of the U.S. government on efforts to deter violations of international humanitarian law and secure unconditional humanitarian access and operational independence for humanitarian organizations and their personnel, especially among non-state armed groups. In Ethiopia, for example, U.S. diplomats, including our USAID DART, or Disaster Assistance Response Team, worked tirelessly to support the November 2022 signing of the Cessation of Hostilities Agreement. Since the agreement was finalized, humanitarian access, and as a result, humanitarian conditions into northern Ethiopia's Afar, Amhara, and particularly Tigray regions has continued to improve. Furthermore, building on the many years of advocacy from many of those in the room, I see Joel Charney standing here, as well as the convening efforts of CSIS, the U.S., along with our co-drafter, Ireland, led efforts to secure the passage of the UN Security Council Resolution 2664 in December, which created a carve-out from the asset freeze provisions of UN sanctions programs. The resolution ensures that humanitarian assistance can still flow in contexts where UN sanctions target malicious actors, while maintaining critical provisions that prevent aid from being diverted by the very regimes and actors that are inflicting harm on their people. The resolution further makes clear that the UN's critical sanctions tool should not inadvertently tie the hands of humanitarian actors trying to reach the victims of repressive and brutal regimes. The U.S. was the first country in the world to implement the new Security Council resolution with the issuance of general licenses by the Department of Treasury's Office of Foreign Asset Control, or OFAC. These general licenses ease the delivery of much-needed humanitarian aid and other priority programs. Now we need other major donors, particularly in the European Union and its member states, to do their part in also providing these humanitarian exemptions. In closing, we don't see ourselves as merely donors, but as partners, problem solvers, and advocates. I join with you today in a spirit of partnership to work through our greatest challenges as a community whose members each bring unique insight and unique value. My sincere hope is that all of you take away from this conference new knowledge and skills to share and integrate into your everyday work. We also want to learn from you about how we can better support your life-saving mission. We continue to invite fellow humanitarian donors to join us in funding humanitarian research and access initiatives, including the training of frontline negotiations, pre-implementation, management, and maintenance. We further encourage dedicated funds for locally employed personnel safety and security measures, including training, communication equipment, and comprehensive duty of care support. For our part, we will continue to strongly oppose efforts to politicize humanitarian assistance and actions that undermine the impartiality and neutrality of humanitarian organizations. And along with our State Department colleagues, we will continue to engage in humanitarian diplomacy efforts across the world to ensure that the operating space for humanitarian workers and aid remains as open as possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for a wonderful opening speech, for a very important discussion, a very important conference. And I would like to congratulate partners here in Washington, D.C. for putting access on the agenda. It's too often not discussed globally, regionally, nationally, because I think we all agree here today that too many people suffer completely alone in their hour of greatest need. We're not there when they need us. And we're not there for two reasons. Number one, as was said by Rodi in the beginning, the number of people in need has exploded. I'm an old man, and I've been in humanitarian work since the 1970s. The numbers have really historically exploded in a way that we never thought would be possible in a growing world economy. The 340 million in need this year, and it's 60 million higher than the year before. So, the main reason that people suffer alone is that the resource gap is widening. We have less funding per person in need, per person that's fleeing their homes, more than well over 100 million compared to 40 million in the terrible 1990s. And many more hungry, and many more suffering both conflict and climate change. So again, more people are more exposed to more conflict and to climate change than ever before. But then there is the other reason. We are held back, we're blocked, we're not able to go to the families, to the children, women, men who need us. And that's what we're discussing today. There is not access. They have a right to receive our assistance. We have an obligation to provide assistance, and we're held back. In many circumstances, we can do something about that. We could become much better in securing access, principled access, learning from our mistakes, learning from all of the less hard-won lessons of humanitarian work since Henri Dunant at the Battle of Solferino in 1859. So, NRC has been working systematically now for 10 years in reaching the so-called hard-to-reach areas. We identified 10 years back that this would be our contribution. We're an organization with some experience. We were founded in 1946. We have some resources. We have a culture of living by the principles, teaching the principles, learning from our mistakes. So systematically, we invested in this. And I would say the number one partner the last few years has been USAID and the Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance. And what we have been able to do with that partnership is also build partnerships like never before on humanitarian negotiations. Last year, 2022, 1,000 people went through intensive training on humanitarian access, principles, protection, assistance, and how to deal with difficult actors, parties to war, build acceptance, etc. And 90% of those 1,000 people trained in the local languages were non-NRC people. They were local humanitarian activists and operatives. We have systematically built access advisors. Many are here today, by the way. We have them on the global level, regional level, and in few countries. Should have them in all countries. These are experts on how to use the toolbox, the international toolbox, and the local toolbox in reaching people before it is too late. We chair, because of our partnerships, we chair a lot of humanitarian access groups, often with OCHA on the national level. When there are humanitarian access groups, access improves. There's no doubt about it. And all in the humanitarian country team get better in reaching the places where we are not. In working with local organizations, local actors, local authorities, local parties to conflicts to reach these places. And we are doing now humanitarian hard-to-reach assessments, access assessments. And what's coming out is that there are three obstacles, really, three categories of obstacles. Logistics, insecurity and conflict, bureaucratic obstacles, restrictive governments, restrictive parties. Logistics is probably actually the least now in this time and age of our problems. It's often related to resources. You cannot anymore fly to the place. You cannot reach it. There is a natural disaster. There is no physical access. We have too little resources logistically to reach places. We can overcome that. We need more resources. The second one is more difficult. It's the insecurity. It's the conflict. And Sarah mentioned Sudan, where the craziness of two generals has led a whole country bleeding and has paralyzed all humanitarian work. So at the moment, there is really no access. I mean, of course, we're working in several regions still, but the majority of the millions in need, internally displaced refugees and others, are not reached because of the internal armed conflict, intra-military conflict. Again, this will be overcome. Hopefully, not all internationals will leave. There will be leadership also left in the countries for the larger organizations so that we can resume work as soon as possible. The optics are not good that the internationals are leaving and women and children are behind to fend for themselves. The insecurity is, of course, most difficult when we are targeted. And the places where we're targeted by organizations who have declared us as part of the enemy, those are the most difficult places. So, in a way, it's more challenging, in my view, places in the Sahel where armed groups have declared us as their enemy than conventional warfare, where we have methods to do risk management. But then comes the third obstacle, and that's the worst. It's the worst. And so the restrictive government, restrictive bureaucracies, assertive governments, assertive parties who don't want internationals there. They don't want humanitarians there. They don't want witnesses. They don't want independent humanitarian action. They don't want impartial humanitarian action. And one country after the other, it's become more difficult to stay and deliver, difficult to get in expertise, leadership, very difficult for local partners and organizations to move around, to work according to the humanitarian principles. And this one we have to fight, really. Are we letting the assertive authoritarian regimes win by keeping us out, keeping witnesses out, keeping impartial operations that are there to go after needs and not after whom the regime or the parties want us to help? I think this is going to be our greatest challenge in the time to come, because it is even more difficult to mitigate than the insecurity and the logistics in most places. So, what do we do? What do we do? Number one, I think we need to agree that it is unacceptable that tens of millions of people suffer alone. We're not there. We need more resources, and we need it for the neglected and forgotten emergencies. I just come from Central America. Very strong impressions here of these families and these migrants who are in a horrendous situation. And the humanitarian response plans are a quarter funded. And the migrants are going on flip-flops through the Darien Gap. There's no one there for them. It's unacceptable, and it's really unacceptable that regimes let parts of the population that they are responsible for suffer rather than have independent, impartial humanitarian action, local, national, international, reach them. Second, we need to increase capacity for access, negotiations, access, acceptance, access, the whole toolbox of humanitarian actions work. I think it's important to remember that we've learned something over the last 150 years, really. It is possible to build acceptance. It is possible to get even armed actors to wars to understand that it is in their interest that there is no epidemic disease. There is that you let the civilian population on the other side get food, then it's also possible to get your own civilian population to get food. The reciprocity, there is a lot of rules and regulations in humanitarian law that helps access, but that's not necessarily intuitive. So the training sponsored by USAID, for example, is very important. The local knowledge also has to be brought to us. We come from outside. Yes, we know of humanitarian law, humanitarian principles, international rules and regulations. We have experience from many difficult situations. But they know of their local customs, they know of their local languages, they know of their local traditions, really. They can help. So it's also listen and learn in a dialogue if you want to have access. Thirdly, there needs to be advocacy. There needs to be private advocacy, there needs to be public advocacy. I think it's important that we do not accept that there are now an increasing number of places where the military rulers and the dictators and the authoritarian regimes and the parties to conflict are getting away with murder, really, because we're not there. And we're afraid for the little access we have, and therefore we don't tell about the access we lack. Fourth, humanitarian diplomacy is important. We need to have principled, systematic outreach to all who can influence the situation. Often our close partners, the donor countries, have influence. Many places they don't. Sarah mentioned, the outrageous banning of female colleagues in Afghanistan. I mean, the emir in Kandahar is not really listening to the NATO countries that were beaten in battle. If they listen to anyone, it would be other Islamic countries, their neighbors, those who are there, those who did not leave, etc. We need to work with them. We need to work with the Russians, because we don't have access to the Russian-occupied areas of Ukraine. And the situation is worse on average in those areas than in those controlled by the government of Ukraine. And we have to do that even though our donors are on one side of this conflict. We're neutral. We will remain also neutral in Ukraine, and we need to accept that many of our local partners do not see themselves as neutral. We need to live by the principles because we should be on all sides of the conflict. And finally, I think localization, that we're discussing a lot, and communication with affected communities will also help us with access. We need to listen to those who are there, get them to advise on what's possible, what they want, etc., and marry that with the international humanitarian principles. Only then can we reach the millions we are now not reaching because access is denied. Thank you.
Thank you both for your insightful remarks. Before we turn to some other questions, I actually wanted to see if we could talk about this question that Sarah raised about leveraging, in this case, the US government, USAID voice. But Jan also spoke very eloquently about the different points that he was making on things that we could do. Where do we go from here? And I'm wondering if we could look at that a little bit more closely, what this leverage, how we leverage, when we leverage, who should be leveraging. And if, Sarah, you could speak to the US government and partners, and perhaps, Jan, you could talk to the NRC, but also the broader humanitarian UN, specifically, community. because it seems to me that there has been a lot of work done on humanitarian access and thinking about it, but how do we actually apply this? One size does not fit all. There are different situations across the globe, as you both have drawn out certain examples, but I'm hearing also that we need a bit of a sea change in how we leverage our voices and make this known. So I'm going to turn to Sarah first, and then to Jan. Thank you.
So Jan spoke eloquently about the importance and the centrality of humanitarian principles and neutrality in particular for our humanitarian partners. I think on the BHA side, on the USAID side, we fully recognize that one piece of our role is protecting the space for our partners to act in an impartial, in a neutral way, that our support is given impartially. But the US government itself is not a neutral actor, and we have certainly diplomatic tools, leverage at our disposal. And one of the pieces of what Administrator Power talks about in terms of progress beyond programs, and also the value of having a seat for USAID at the National Security Council table, which has not always been the case, is there are forums both at a local level between our humanitarian staff on the ground and our embassies, but also back here in Washington, for us to elevate these issues of humanitarian diplomacy, of actions that can and should be taken in order to create the enabling environment that allows our partners to act in an impartial and neutral way in the delivery of assistance. And we take that responsibility incredibly seriously at BHA. I think for some staff, it's a new skill set. It's very different than kind of being technical advisors on humanitarian programs, but starting to use our voice and increasingly to use our voice again in advocating for what we think will improve conditions on the ground for the people that we're collectively concerned about. That requires very close contact, deep discussions with our NGO partners, with our UN interlocutors. There is often a bit of a division of labor between things we can say out loud that other actors can't, or things we can raise in private diplomacy, put on the table, have access to actors that maybe your teams don't have, and again, getting us all a little bit more comfortable with that dialogue is part of what we're doing in BHA.
I think I agree with all of that, Sarah. In the humanitarian world, I often find analysis pretty weak of who's really in charge here, who can unlock this, who's behind the evil, how can we reach those who can influence those who are there. And of course, it is a problem that we are totally unevenly funded. It's a Western thing to fund humanitarian aid. I mean, we have Japan, which is also part politically of the Western project in many ways. It will be a big effort for all of us to try to get Iran and Russia and China and so on to try to influence. Myanmar is not influenced by the West. The Taliban is not influenced by the West. Mali is not influenced by the West anymore. The French are out. Colonial powers are out. And it's not easy for us to get Moscow now to listen to us. We did in NRC a lot of work, went to Moscow. I always met with the US, the Russian missions. They helped us in Venezuela. They helped us in many places. With the Ukraine war, it has become much more difficult. What I hope is, of course, that the West, like the US, can help us where they can help us, like Israel, which is, of course, not so a comfortable thing necessarily. But I use this opportunity to say it's outrageous what the new Israeli government is doing in terms of access and opportunities to help Palestinian children in the West Bank and Gaza. And that's an area where we hope the US can help us. And then we have to approach the others on say, the Taliban in Afghanistan.
Yes, thank you. I'd like to draw out a piece of this which relates to something that both of you raised on localization. And so, Sarah, if I may, I'll turn to you first. USAID and BHA specifically have made a big push to include local partners in humanitarian responses worldwide. Do you see more localized responses as helping overcome challenges to humanitarian access, and if so, how? And the reason I'm partly asking this is USAID has made this big push, and yet a very low percentage, really, across the board, has been actually given to and worked through local partners. So it's a conundrum, and it's a safety and security question, it's lots of things, but if you could unpack that for us for a little bit, that would be great.
I think there's no question that the reality is that in many contexts, local partners have access that international organizations do not. And so even when you start to kind of dig into the money flows, at the end of the day, it is often local NGOs that are doing the delivery of assistance in the hardest to reach places. That was no doubt the case in Northwest Syria, and one of the big tenets of our earthquake response was trying to channel as many resources as possible directly or as close to directly to Syrian organizations that were operational on the ground, particularly in Northwest Syria. We did this through a couple of different channels, both direct awards to a select number of local partners, but also putting a significant amount, close to $60 million behind 2 cross-border pooled funds that the majority of that funding flowed to local Syrian organizations. So it is definitely part of our approach to support local organizations more directly, particularly in these contexts where they have access. I think it is not the solution to access, as Jan mentioned in his remarks. There are places and spaces where international presence has a protective effect. And we still very much want to advocate, including in Northwest Syria. And one of the very small bright lights we've seen in the post-earthquake period in Northwest Syria is the resumption of kind of UN presence in a limited way after years of them not being present in Northwest Syria. And again, there is a protective element to that kind of international presence in these types of contexts. And I think we certainly don't want to see a scenario where we're, again, just shifting risk, even if it's with additional resources, shifting risk to local partners in these contexts where that kind of full ecosystem of local partners working in real partnership and concert with international actors is needed to make real progress on these access issues.
Yeah. May I use the opportunity to actually congratulate USAID by making a big push on localization and being now, US going from having little attention to this to have a lot of attention to this. And then I have my hat on as the eminent person of the grand bargain here also, where the goal is 25%, as you say. Globally, it could be 2%, 3%, or 4%, depending on how you count money going through. It could be more if you count all money going through the UN to the local group. Way behind. USAID is making a big leap. I think we will see change. The other one to congratulate the US on is should have done that. The sanctions carve out for humanitarian work under sanctions regime and counterterrorism legislation is admirable. The US has gone from being the worst during the previous administration to become the best of the Western powers of this, actually. I mean, the French are now behind on this. It shows that things can change and access can improve also by policy decisions. In wartime, the best blend is local groups with international groups. There's no doubt about it. We have a conscious decision. We're not going to chase natural disasters in any places without a conflict. The local groups are more expensive than us. They're on the ground. They will be able to respond immediately. Why should we come from Norway to the Philippines when there is a Filipino Red Cross? Much better. However, there is no doubt that in many of these conflict situations, the local groups are very vulnerable. They are often partisan. I would be if there was a war in my country, actually. And the blend of internationals and locals is the best to reach people on all sides of the conflicts. Like in Syria, well, we're in the northwest, east, northeast, and in the government-controlled areas as NRC, don't publish it too much. And we're working with local groups in all of these three areas, and they are poles apart as local groups.
Yes, thank you. Jan, you mentioned how much we have learned also over past decades in our response, and particularly with humanitarian access. And I'm curious about your response to this, and Sarah, you as well. Many observers do not speak as much now about COVID-19 and the humanitarian sector, but for a period of time, there was talk of how it could transform humanitarian response, including with respect to access, as international NGOs evacuated international staff and leaned more heavily on remote management and local actors. What, if any, lessons have been learned from humanitarian responses taking place during the pandemic that, if applied, might help relieve some of the barriers to this international access question?
I mean, two things. The first and biggest is the good thing that we really realized that we swim or we sink with our national staff, really. National staff courageously went into the camps just before the lockdown in many places, and stayed in the camps, many places, Uganda, Jordan, and so on, for weeks and months, basically, serving the refugees when we knew the camps would be closed, for example, for refugee camps. And it just showed that we can nationalize much more than we thought when that kind of a process. The ratio would often be 1,000 local national staff, 5 internationals. Would we need international? I think it's not a bad thing with international for transfer of knowledge, etc., and also for reporting, etc. What's possibly bad is that we think that more can be done remotely than should be done remotely. And here comes in protection. You know, cash is the best way of giving support, but if the cash is by the ether into a phone or a card, and the bad guys comes next day and take everything, or tell us what's happening. Tell us, has there been sexual and gender-based violence? Yes, well, a lot of it. Was it you who told that we are criminals and we're not there in proximity? It's not good. So actually, the remoteness of operations has clear problems, and is part of the access access is a challenge. We need to be there. We need to have proximity to the people in need.
Sarah, do you have anything to add?
Maybe just to add, and kind of in violent agreement with Jan, I think no doubt COVID highlighted the critical nature again of kind of those localized responses, whether it be local staff of international organizations or local organizations themselves, but also the limitations of that remote management. And when we saw the edicts come down in Afghanistan first in December and now more recently extending the ban on female aid workers to the UN as well, I think many of our partners have at various points looked to some of those coping strategies from that COVID period to look at, are there ways to support female staff to, do man hotlines or do the kind of remote management approaches that were adopted during the most acute phases of the COVID response. And while there's some potential there, I think there's also real limitations. And I think we do, as Jan said, we see this most acutely in the kind of protection work that we know is so critical in all humanitarian responses, but particularly when we have these significant access challenges. And that can't be replaced by kind of cash transfers on mobile phones or airdrops or episodic kind of delivery opportunities of food. It really requires sustained engagement, individual case management, safe spaces for women and children and other victims of abuse or other vulnerable individuals. So I think we have to be careful not to overstate the potential of some of these approaches.
Yes, thanks. All right, so Sarah, conflict remains a major driver of humanitarian need and denied access. Yet the increase in the effects of climate change also portend a future where infrastructure weaknesses and limited disaster response present formidable hurdles. What are ways USAID and BHA can plan or is planning for those kinds of crises and ways to build greater access and resilience?
Well, Jan touched a bit on it when he said NRC has made a decision. We're not going to go into a Philippines after a Typhoon Rai or respond to natural disasters in that kind of jump in, jump out sort of way. I think we actually do have some good learning, some good experience, particularly in Asia and Latin America, in working over a very long period of time with very local organizations as well as authorities. This is where the kind of the neutrality and impartiality conversations sometimes get a little trickier as we start to talk about adaptation approaches, where we really have invested and are scaling up our investment in those very localized adaptation and preparedness approaches. I'll put a plug in for our Climate Smart Disaster Ready APS that has been out on the street, $200 million to support local approaches to adaptation and disaster risk reduction. Again, really seeing the future of a lot of our climate adaptation and risk reduction work with local actors, whether they be civil society organizations or local institutions, including local government and regional governments.
Agree.
Do you want to add anything on that?
It was well said by Sarah.
I agree. Mm-hmm. Okay, so Jan, you recently tweeted about branding and the way humanitarian organizations are compelled to label many of their contributions. To what extent do you think branding increases access challenges? Might a more subtle approach be valuable in contested environments, and what might this look like?
Yeah, no, it has gotten a lot of attention. The tweet on the branding, I said it's increasingly distasteful how we as international donors and international aid agencies have to advertise ourselves on school bags and on children, in the countries where we work. So it's more like let's lower a little bit our charity, and let's rather be a little bit more interested in the dignity of the people we serve. Branding is, of course, important also, but however, for access. The Red Cross emblem, reverse of the Swiss flag, was invented as a protective emblem. The blue flag of the UN is the protected emblem. Our orange is a protective emblem, and in many, many circumstances, it works. So, of course, we go into, as unarmed, into areas and and there should be a flag on our vehicles. And also, for honesty, we should tell who we are. I mean, we're running around as guests in these countries. They should know who we are. So we should be branded. The problem, again, is the moment we're targeted. In Sudan, I don't think we're targeted for being humanitarian. I think we're targeted because we have fuel and vehicles and things, and they have lost control over there is no unity of command. Typical situation. In Al-Qaeda, ISIS, they don't like us or anyone else. They like themselves, basically, and they come after us. And there it is a real decision. Do we go undercover, which is not good for humanitarians, but we do it for survival issues. In general, we should brand ourselves. We shouldn't brand the people we help. We don't need to tell them that it's Norwegian or US assistance that is really helping you, or that NRC is really giving this tent. It shouldn't be anything on. It should be theirs, not ours.
Yes, fair enough. Sarah, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I'll just add, I think, this is one of those places where we really come to our partners in that spirit of partnership. And I think we have a pretty good track record of working with our partners for very context-specific approaches to branding, including, in many cases, waiving branding requirements if the security situation is such that would endanger the work. I will say, I have heard from my fellow donors increasing grumbling that there's very heavy branding of, some of our partners, and that they're hearing from their political masters. And I think it's worth remembering, as much as I'm here, quote, as the donor, the real donor is the U.S. public. Through their representatives in the U.S. Congress, and there is kind of the face and the story that we have with the people that we're working with, that we're supporting, the branding that makes sense in context, and then there's also, I think, work that, frankly, collectively we need to do to kind of, quote, give credit and tell the story of what kind of our respective populations have been able to support in terms of the power and the work overseas. And that balance is not easy, but I do worry sometimes when we look at branding in too narrow a way, there is a risk too of losing a little bit of that story with our public, frankly, that allows us to continue to support the important work.
I see that. I mean, and we need to be better to really explain to the general public that assistance works. We're saving lives. We're getting children into school. We're providing livelihoods. It's the only way. I mean, again, in Central America, if there's no hope for the youth in Central America, they will all wander north. And there is possible to create both education, livelihoods, safety, security. We're doing that. And we need to get that story across. We need to be better in that. But I think the solution to this, donors coming and seeing that UN agencies have plastered their thing all over the place, and wasn't it us, the ECHO, European Union, who gave it? And so we need also to have it on. Take away both, logos. In my view, you don't have the UN agencies or NRC one, and you don't have to have the Norwegian government thing. They should be spared that one.
Yes, thank you. So I'd like to ask one more question before we wrap up this session, and I will ask for you to be mindful of time. I know it's a big question, but I think it has come up. So let's talk about humanitarian principles. Given the overall state of affairs with access, is it time to reckon with a new approach to guide principled action that goes beyond concepts of impartiality, neutrality, and independence, and to try to create a different way that matches better, perhaps, with humanitarian realities on the ground? And I would like just to hear your views on this, just briefly. Thank you.
I mean, I think the easy answer is, or the not so easy answer, but kind of the first answer is, in some ways, those humanitarian principles are more important than ever. I mean, I think we have to keep kind of telling the story and supporting our partners of why, in particular, kind of the impartial delivery of assistance, the neutrality of humanitarian actors is so critical for the project writ large. I think that's not to say that there aren't really difficult questions, particularly when you start to think about localization, when you start to think about basic service delivery in humanitarian context, when you start to look at the very real need to invest in fragile context in a much more sustained way, in an institution building way, even when the state is not super present, when the state is super present and has some humanitarian capacity, like right now in Ukraine. I think we've been in a pretty robust dialogue in Kyiv and elsewhere about, there's a lot of cash, humanitarian cash, that's flowing through humanitarian partners. You also have a Ministry of Social Protection that is supporting social safety net programs, and we as the US government are putting a lot of money into direct support for the Ukrainian government. Are there ways that some pieces of the humanitarian caseload can and should be supported by the government of Ukraine, a government that has the capacity in many ways and the willingness to meet a lot of the humanitarian needs of its population? They don't necessarily do the kind of vulnerability targeting that our humanitarian partners do. And at first, I think there was some resistance among our partners but we do it differently. But can we work with them to take similar approaches? This requires, again, using new muscles, and making those kind of transitions doesn't negate the need to, for example, not take our eyes off of those that are living in non-government controlled areas behind the line of contact, who are their needs are not going to be met by the Ukrainian state. And so again, there will continue to be a robust need for humanitarian partners that can operate in an impartial way, but we do have to be comfortable with a certain amount of working with governments that are willing and able to meet the humanitarian needs of their populations.
I agree that actually, as we have more and more assertive governments, difficult parties were under attack, we should not yield on the humanitarian principles. They are more important than ever, in my view. The most misunderstood one is neutrality. Impartiality is intuitive. We go where the needs are, and that is usually not debated, not under attack, but neutrality is. And our Ukrainian partners are basically saying, I think I already mentioned that, we're not neutral. We want our government to win this. I understand it and I accept it. But we in NRC want to be there as soon as we have access to Crimea and parts of the Luhansk and Donetsk, where people speak Russian, where they may be indoctrinated by Russian TV, whatever. They will be very reluctant to work with those who come in with the force that will retake these areas. We would be able to work on both sides. That's neutrality. Some say, no, yeah, neutrality is really, we cannot criticize the president, and we need to still play tennis with the president's wife, and we being in bed with all parties in a way. That's neutrality. No, it's to be critical on behalf of the people in need of the various side, and at times criticize one side more than the other because they are doing most of the violations. So I think it's very important that it's part of our humanitarian negotiations effort, Sarah, funded by you, to explain that the humanitarian principle is a way we survive on the battlefield, really, and we need to live by them, but we also need to be smart and understand them, and the misunderstanding must be done away with.
Great. Well, Sarah, yes. Sarah, Jan, thank you so much, both of you, for your remarks, for your insightful responses. Really grateful to have you here today. Thank you.